Presenter number 5 from Grouping 2, Humanities, Arts, Social Sciences, Mr. Aidan Ricketts from Southern Cross University, and his title is Articulating a Language for Non-Linear Change. When you're ready.
Okay, so what I'm doing with my research basically is having a look at complexity theory, which is basically mostly science and sometimes mathematics, which looks into the chaotic and often unpredictable nature of the behaviour of natural systems, anything from galaxies to particle behaviour to the way ecological communities work. But what's sort of different is really applying that in more of the social setting. That in itself is not entirely new in that complexity theory and the applying of those natural phenomena to the social phenomena has happened, particularly in organisational theory. People have looked at it in terms of partnerships, government bureaucracies and corporations, but strangely enough it hasn't been applied to social change movements. Social change movements, what I mean by those is really there's sort of the large decentralised movements for political change that we see from time to time. We could mention, say, feminism, environmentalism, or the one I'm particularly engaged with, the climate change movement. So in terms of my research, how I'm approaching that is by looking at case studies of particular local and networked global social change movements and looking at the way they either currently resemble the behaviour of natural systems in the way they operate internally, but perhaps more importantly, how they can actually use insights from complexity theory as a way of really accelerating their capacity to bring change about in the world. Effectively, if we look at climate change, for example, and we think about this idea of how change occurs, what we see in the world is that major social change tends to happen not on a slow sort of linear trajectory, but through reaching a tipping point in which fundamental change happens quickly. Some of the obvious examples we have of that are things like the Arab Spring or the fall of the Soviet Union. So, and when we get to the issue of climate change, obviously, we're either going to be reaching a sort of a geophysical tipping point, which is going to be quite catastrophic, or we're going to bring about social change in a fundamental way, and we're going to have to do that very, very quickly. We're finding that the sort of the linear programmatic approaches to doing that, going to Kyoto, going and having yet another sort of government speak, is not necessarily getting us there. So one of the tasks for social change movements is to really start to accelerate that social change process and make it push towards a tipping point where we can bring about fundamental change quickly. And one of the frustrating things about social change is you're often in the Sisyphus part of that program and you're not sure you're ever going to actually break through. But the good news is if you can really work with the system effects, and I think this is where the insights of working with natural systems really comes across, to realise if you can work with those natural effects and build up the system effects, you can get to a point where you get to your tipping point and you can really flow through with rapid change. This is sort of innovative because I think one of the things that's happened with social change movements a lot previously is because large non-government organisations often are very reliant on their donor base, they tend to develop these linear kind of plans and these programmatic plans similar to what often bureaucratic institutions do as a way really of both impressing the donors and giving the illusion of sort of certainty and predictability to the kind of social plans they come up with. But what we really know is that real social change, particularly fundamental shifts in society, are not linear, they're not particularly predictable, and they're much more likely to happen in terms of fundamental tipping points. Effectively, one of the projects is to really develop a language so that social change movements can have a new set of tools and a new set of language for developing plans for stimulating social change, particularly much needed social change like climate change transition, and that language can compete with the established language we have for programmatic change. What I would say about programmatic change is it tends to be the map and not the territory. So what we really find when we start to bring these things together is that what social change movements can really do is look at all of the forces for change that exist, get on board with those and begin to nudge change in the direction they need to nudge it in, rather than taking this sort of the linear approach where you think that you're somehow in control of the change that's going to come about. It's an iterative process in which you can only nudge change in the present and then nudge it again in the present. So the idea is that social change movements will then focus more on the condition building conditions for fundamental shifts, rather than coming up with these sort of maps that are not really the territory that are trying to control that change. So when I really sort of, reflect on this, one of the things that I find so sort of exciting about the idea is that the most vulnerable thing about the status quo is the fact it's the status quo.